Our next form of writing is one which is very similar to both the Psalms and in terms of poetry. And that's called the Proverbs. The Proverbs. In our Tanakh, we have the main corpus of Proverbs is, of course, the book of Proverbs, often attributed to Solomon. Obviously, Solomon, the son of King David, who when he was asked what he would like to have or what he would like as a blessing once he became king, is he asked for wisdom. And so that's why we often attribute this book of Proverbs. However, the truth of it is that most probably the book of Proverbs is really a collection of little thoughts that have been collected over a long period of time. Maybe it was collected by Solomon, but most probably was collected much later than that as well. A collection of sayings that would connect them to the understanding of what was good or what wasn't. But to understand a proverb, again, just like with poetry and just like with psalms or hymns or songs, is that proverbs are both contextual and cultural. Contextual, so therefore they're within a particular context, within an environment in which the people were living, and cultural, in that they actually would be within a particular culture and a particular cultural understanding. We also need to understand that proverbs are written in a poetic or symbolic style. And as a symbolic or a metaphorical style means that we need to understand what those words symbolize and what particularly they connect with. In, for example, the book of Proverbs, we see that we have the personification, the making into a person of wisdom. And in fact, wisdom is Sophia, is a female person and connects with that. And so when you read about this female, this woman who is in the book of Proverbs, she's not a real woman, but rather is a personification, is a metaphor of wisdom and of the wisdom that comes out of Proverbs. So we have to be very careful in our interpretation of Proverbs. We have to be very careful in our understanding of what they really mean. Because otherwise what we can do is we can quote them. And we often do. I mean, there's so many of the Proverbs of Solomon that we just quote as part of the English language. One of which, for example, is, "Spare the rod and spoil the child," to use the King James version of that particular proverb. Spare the rod and spoil the child. And of course, what that became a particular justification for, certainly in my schooling career, was corporal punishment. I remember my first day of school having red hands because my teacher believed that, well, you know, if I'm going to be the child that I should be, then the way in which to make that sure happening was to use a ruler on my hands. Of course, you won't get away with that today. But the truth of it is that I'm not sure that actually hitting my hand because I wasn't writing neatly was necessarily the best way to encourage me to enjoy school. However, when in fact she was taken to task by another parent, she was quite prepared to quote Proverbs saying, "Well, I don't spare the rod because I don't want to spoil the child." But of course, the truth of it is that when it uses the word rod there, it wasn't actually referring to an actual implement of physical punishment. In fact, when you read that passage, what you need to see or understand about it is that rod there is a symbol of the concept of discipline. And discipline is not about corporal punishment. Discipline is about understanding boundaries and rules and the connections of how we live within the boundaries of God's freedom. In fact, what it's saying is that spare children from understanding Torah and you'll end up with a child who will no longer follow the faith. Now, I'm not sure that's got anything to do with corporal punishment or smacking children because they're naughty. It's less about naughtiness and much more about discipline. And that's what we need to understand about the Proverbs when we do interpretation, is we need to interpret them within their context, within their culture. Otherwise, we begin to use them in a very haphazard way, or we begin to use them in a very literal way, and often to justify what we want to do in the first place. And so we can use the Proverbs as a way of whatever we want to achieve or to happen, we can do it by virtue of saying, well, the Bible says. And when we say the Bible says, then obviously that makes everything we do okay. Well, I don't think so. I think what we have to do is to make sure we interpret those passages correctly, that we interpret them both within context and within culture. And if we do that first, then we can begin to take the wisdom and the truth that is behind those proverbs and then apply them within our context and our culture.